You're listening to Designing the 21st Century. If you're a New Yorker, even if you're not interested in architecture, you certainly know the name of architect Rosario Candela. In the 20s, Candela shaped New York with the most legendary apartment houses, which became the crown jewels of New York. In fact, even today, 100 years later, his apartments are still the most sought after, the most desired, the most iconic in New York. While you won't find Candela's name in the classical books of 20th century architecture, this gifted architect, an Italian immigrant who graduated from Columbia in 1915, invented the visual built fabric of residential Manhattan. While creating the best apartment houses in history, probably, majestic with formal galleries, grand scale rooms, high ceilings, and the perfect classical proportions, he gifted New Yorkers a unique collective memory. They are the ultimate expressions of New York living, capturing all of what we think of as classic New York. A new book titled Rosario Candela and the New York Apartment was recently published, and I invited its author, David Netto, here today. David is a design connoisseur, writer, and interior designer who has cultivated an expertise in art, design, and architecture history, as well as a keen eye for historic buildings. Hi, David.
Daniela, it's so good to be here with you.
I'm so excited about the book.
Thank you.
It's the first book on Candela, isn't it?
It's the first book on Candela alone, and the first book on the sort of top 20 apartment buildings that people care about with the sexy apartments in them. There has been one other book about jointly Rosario Candela and another architect of New York apartments called J.E.R. Carpenter by a historian called Andrew Alpern. But this is the Candela book that we've been waiting for, that you've been waiting for.
Is it? Can we say that he was in the right time, in the right place?
I think you can say that about him more than almost any personage in architecture or any field. You can say that about him as much as you can say that about anybody, because the last 5 years of the 1920s were economically the moment that apartment houses as a residential architectural form completely took over from private mansions in New York, which had been the way of life before from the Gilded Age. And he was there with his genius and his innovations and the funding that came from the developers who backed him to answer the call.
But also, I can say that he really achieved the American dream. Think about it. He came to New York in 1910 from Sicily. He didn't speak English before he went to Columbia, and then he shaped the entire skyline of New York.
He shaped the entire skyline of the Upper East Side of New York. I would say that is a point I care about making, because everybody knows and loves the skyline of the financial district and the stone skyscrapers of downtown. So one of the points I want to make about Candela's career is that he gave Uptown a skyline too. How he came to be in that position is a series of miracles, some of which remain unexplained because of the points you make. But he certainly didn't seem to lack confidence in his own abilities, because the legend about his desk in Columbia Architecture School was that he kept a velvet rope around it so that people couldn't get close enough to copy his designs.
Wow.
No one knows if that's really true, but it's been repeated often enough that I like to believe it.
You know, I remember, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, I saw you at the Museum of the City of New York. And they had an exhibition on Candela, and there was an event, a talk, and I saw you there. And I understand the book came from that talk?
Yes, indeed. The book was hatched that night because I loved the talk so much and the exhibition so much that I grabbed Peter Penoyer, who had designed the exhibition, and Paul Goldberger, who had spoken on the panel, out on the terrace in the fading summer light, and I said, "Who's going to write the Candela book? Is it you? Is it you?" No, it's us. We're going to write the Candela book. And the exhibition sort of raised the level of urgency in my mind to do this, both because it had been a project in my head since I was in college and I started writing about him, and because I was then recognizing that the material was such a hit that I was worried somebody else would write it, and it was time to get to work.
But I also read in the book that you have a story, very personal story, with Candela as growing up in the city.
I know what you mean. I make fun of myself in the essay that starts with the title "Nerds." As a small child, I was not gifted athlete. I was an only child. I was alone walking to school a lot, not feeling great about life. And so I looked up and I looked at the skyline of Candela's buildings on Park Avenue around 73rd, 74th Street, and was fascinated by what the terraces signified in terms of what mystery, was behind them in terms of the apartments. What were those layouts? How were they different from the ones below? Why did that look like a chimney attaching itself to the water tower? And, the mechanics, not just the aesthetics of those, Sicilian hill towns full of drama up at the skyline. And so my interest in Candela was both formally because I love to look at his buildings, and emotionally because my father wanted to move to his buildings and was always sort of carrying around floor plans and talking about apartments that we might get to move to. And they all had one name on the plan attached to them, Rosario Candela.
Wow. This is how things start. I
was probably 7, 8, 9 years old.
It's really amazing. And, there are many famous people that have lived in these buildings, famously Jackie Onassis and others. But what does it mean to live today in a Candela building?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that it's an interesting moment to contemplate that question because the buildings are now about to turn 100. It's sort of 1925 to 1930 that we're talking about for the most interesting ones. And they're going to be 100 years old. And for a long, long time, that they were the only options for a certain kind of high living in New York, which until the late 90s meant that Candela and the sort of system of co-op management of these buildings and ownership was the only option. You could live in a big townhouse, but if you wanted to live in a fancy apartment with a sort of address that signified something, it was a co-op, and it was likely a Candela building that you wanted to be in. Now there are all of these glass skyscrapers, and they're all condos. And some of them aren't glass. There are buildings like 15 Central Park West that are very much descended and inspired by Candela's architecture, which are also condos. So there's that option. But I would say that Candela's buildings have held their own because they are irreproducible. The new buildings now are not. I'm not going to make a comment as to whether they're less or more. They are different. And if you want what the best that New York has to offer architecturally to live in, there's no competition. He's still the top of the top. I mean, look at the way people talk about 740 Park Avenue and 834 Fifth Avenue and 960 Fifth Avenue. They don't talk about other buildings that way.
Yeah,
I'm not naming any addresses. I'm just saying other buildings.
Because it also means when you live in a Candela building today, it says something about your taste.
Correct.
Level.
I very much agree.
Like what?
Well, it says that you, what does it say? That's such a good question. I haven't thought about it in terms of now versus the whole span of the time of their lives.
Also, it means you're rooted in New York.
Well, let me answer the question in a broader way than you maybe intended, which is part of what I write about in the book. Is it always said something about your taste, even when there were many new beautiful buildings and they all looked like that. There was River House, there were other buildings on Sutton Place, and lots of buildings on Park and Fifth Avenue, not by Candela. Candela's buildings always had the sort of cream of society, the big society names, Jock Whitney's sister, Gary Cooper got married to his, uptown bride at 778 Park Avenue. Brooke Astor could have lived anywhere. She lived in that building as well. Those sorts of people, the top of New York socially, have always made Candela buildings their home. And so I think it means that taste, which figured that out in 1930, is still behind the way people want to live in one of his great buildings now.
Totally.
It's appreciation for the refinement of the architecture and the way of life that those spaces can provide.
And also like unpretentious type of taste.
Correct. That's why I think Paul Goldberger titled his essay "The Architecture of Certainty." He wanted to express the sort of low-key discretion and self-assurance of Candela's design instincts. I'm more fascinated by the drama, which has to do with the water towers and the terraces and scale of certain things and so forth. Paul explored the self-assurance of his architecture.
So do you want to talk about the real estate?
To give me another leg up on that.
Meaning, if you buy an apartment in Candela's building, what does it mean in terms of the real estate value?
Well, co-ops are a little bit under pressure right now because of all of the condo competition. So the market, which is not the only judge of the value of anything, but it's a factor, is now accounting for the volume of options that are different kinds of buildings, being places that rich people can go live without the inconvenience of co-op board applications and not being able to finance the apartment fully, which most co-ops you cannot, if at all. And also the summer schedule work rules aspect to these very fancy buildings. Usually it takes 2 years to gut renovate an apartment because you're only allowed to do messy work in the summers. So all of that is sort of ganged up on the value somewhat of Candela architecture and 20s apartment buildings in general, co-ops, in favor of Billionaires Row and the glass, needle buildings and so forth. The real estate is solid. It's still the best that you can buy in New York. I would say that the value that represents is higher than ever because I look at glass buildings and they might be pretty cool and look like they belong on a TV show like Succession and so forth. But I know that if I had the dough, I would be headed for a Candela building.
Of course.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
Because I'm so refined.
Yeah. Yes, you are.
Well,
but
I'm
something,
aspirational.
On the same note, it looks like his, I would say, formula for buildings still holds even today.
Yes.
Architects like Robert A.M. Stern.
Yes.
Famously designing after Candela, and it's still very desirable.
It is an enduring image of the good life in New York, which from the moment it was actualized in the late 20s, when Candela took the romance of downtown Wall Street skyscrapers, the form of that, the terraces, the stepping back in the height, and offered the option of being able to live in such a building. And he was, the first or among the very first of the architects to do that. That immediately triggered a romantic idea of the good life in New York, which has never gone away or become less relevant.
If you look at architecture books, I'm talking about the classic books that were published, let's say, in the 30s through the end of the 20th century. You cannot find a mention of his buildings.
Hardly at all.
So I want to ask two questions. One is why, and two, how important is architecture to a contribution to the history of architecture?
Okay, so the term starchitect did not exist until fairly recently. There were starchitects like Frank Lloyd Wright and people that were very adept at self-promotion. But Candela was the opposite of that sort of architect. He was almost a journeyman. He was every inch an artist in terms of his design abilities. We can judge. But he did not promote himself that way, and there was not a culture for a name brand architect to be attached to these buildings that anybody expected to care about. Even River House was designed by William Lawrence Bottomley, who was a society architect of well-known country houses. He was in society. Nobody cared that he was the architect of that building or sold the apartments with his name in any kind of, promotional context. So Candela, even less so. He was the little Sicilian guy that nobody heard of, and in fact was bearded for by some big name architects like Warren and Wetmore and Cross, who were better known to the clientele for these apartments. So a name of an architect who might have designed their friends' country houses in Oyster Bay. That's what they were. And Candela was the real designer of the buildings, but they were brought on to make them look sort of patrician. And the name, if there was one that was involved in these buildings, designed to sell them, was Dorothy Draper. She very often designed the lobbies. And, when it said lobby designed by Dorothy Draper, the people got the message that this was a building that anybody could sell a mansion and move into and not lose any stature. So she did the heavy lifting that way. Candela's talent was recognized by his fellow Sicilian developers, Michael Paterno and Anthony Campagna. And whether any of his clients ever met him, the ultimate buyers for these apartments, or certainly knew or cared about his name, I think the answer is likely no.
You say that his buildings are not duplicable. What does it mean?
Okay, his buildings are not duplicable now because of a cost. The cost would be prohibitive.
Even the ones with the bricks.
Yeah, because they're full of cut stone. There are 4 fireplaces in an apartment. There are, you'd have $1 billion in the construction of whatever. I'm making that number up, but to recreate as is value of 834 Fifth Avenue or 720 Park Avenue would be completely prohibitive in terms of cost. And so that's one reason that they're not duplicable. The other reason is that nobody has the cryptographic mind to design the setbacks culminating in the water tower, which is, his genius gift of as a form giver, and create floor plans that correspond to the need to terrace back in response to the 1916 zoning law, which required that a building set back 2.5 times the width of the street that it faced.
When
Before
did this
Candela,
end? When did this end?
Well, it began and ended with Candela. I mean, all architecture in New York of this type and most types ends in 1930 with the Depression. Stock crash stops everything. And there are no more skyscrapers for years, until the 40s, and then the international style is how people are designing.
So what about 740 Park Avenue? That's like the most expensive, desirable building in the world. Tell me about living there. Have you been to apartments there?
I have been to apartments there. I can tell you very little about living there because I've never lived there. But I did live across the street at 730 Park Avenue, and I looked hard at 740 Park Avenue, and I saw what was going on in there in the 80s. And to me, it was fascinating. I mean, it was so much. There was so much social, gossipy social life and everything that you read about in W and Spy magazine in the 80s. That was a very rich time for that. And then there was also so much design history happening there because all that money brought great decorators like Denning and Foucault and Mark Hampton. And you heard about and you saw the apartments that were published eventually in that building. And it's become an encyclopedic window into New York design history because of all of the art and design. I mean, Jacques Grange has done one of his great non-French projects there in New York.
Okay.
That's in the last.
For home, but
I'm not saying. Yeah, and he wouldn't like it if we did.
Fine.
But I can tell you that 740 has some pretty radical taste in it, not just money. And the apartment that Jacques did is one of those examples.
Wow. Is it published in any of his books?
It's in his book.
Oh, okay.
If you look hard, you can always tell from the windows.
You
You can tell from the windows where something is.
So what would you suggest to architects today? What can they learn from Candela?
The lesson that is probably of the most utility to an architect today from Candela is to look at the plans and look at the hierarchy of use that is how he organizes the spaces in the apartment. He was very meticulous. Again, the cryptographer in him, not just the ziggurat setback stuff, but the planning of the rooms. He was very meticulous about making sure that the service area of the apartment could be closed off from the front rooms, and similarly the bedroom, the private wing, of the bedrooms. If you're having a dinner party, there's a way for people to get out to the front living room library and clear drinks and empty ashtrays without walking through the dining room while you're in there sitting, or set a fire for everybody to go into and find after dinner. Apartment design before him, if we go back to a building like the turn of the century or further back to the Dakota, was a long hall, and all the rooms off of it were similar sized, and you could probably look out of the dining room and see someone's bed in their bedroom. Candela was all about creating sequences of space that had separation from one another, and his planning is something that is very useful to look at if you're an architect now.
So you are an interior designer, and you create like wonderful interiors.
I try.
When you look at his buildings, at those apartments, do people live the same way today? How do you really tailor life today to those spaces?
The first thing you do is you go from 4 maids' rooms to 1 or to 0, because everybody wants a bigger kitchen. The service area of Candela Apartments is invariably designed for a staff, and the owner rarely would go in there. You'd go in there and have a conversation and never sit down about the menu, and then it's about 3 or 4 people. And maybe if it's a very fancy building, there's what's called a staff dining room, servants' dining room. That's the servants' hall, because they need a room to eat their meals. That all goes away now and becomes a family room. And then the other thing that you meet again and again is a really large dining room, because meals were served in a sort of ritual way in the house, probably lunch and dinner. So it would be used twice a day. And now the way people live, families, they don't use their dining room. You can barely get them to use their living room. So that needs to be turned into a family room or library dining room.
Okay, David, you always work on the most interesting topics and subjects. What's your next?
Well, I have 2 books in me at some point. Thank you for asking. I might need a break after this 3 books in 3 years thing, which just ended with Candela. But I want to write a book about River House specifically, which is, it's the Rockefeller Center of apartment buildings in New York, and it deserves a complete documentation. And then the other story I have in my head walking around for years is the story of Julian Abel, who was the chief draftsman and right hand of an architect called Horace Trumbauer. Julian Abel was the first black graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts. He was Trumbauer's protege, and he designed many of the finest French classical revival buildings in New York, such as the Duke Mansion, that's NYU, and the Wildenstein Gallery building, and the Elms in Newport, lots of things in Philadelphia. Once Trumbauer, who was one of the really preeminent Gilded Age architects, opened his office, he never did another drawing, and Julian Abel did all of that drawing. And I want to tell the story of the first person of color who was able to actually conjure the 18th century, literally, academically, as good as Gabriel, and not in some sort of robber baron caricature, fashion.
We are lucky to having you.
You're so lucky.
And thank you for being with me
Thank
today.
you for feeling lucky.
It was great. Thank you, David.
I always enjoy talking to you, and I always enjoy listening to you, Daniela. Thank you for having me.
This is Daniela Ohad. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Designing the 21st Century.